Thank you, President Wright. So I had a few things that I was concerned were sort of left out in terms of the overall scope of the report, and it was good to hear input in terms of how the scope was, including the tenant recommendations from the Housing Summit and from the tenant union directly. But some things that I saw that were missing were things like, this is going on in other cities, so I'm just going to bring up things that are being discussed popularly are like rent freezes, rent caps, rent rollbacks. There was some, I don't know if this, I don't even, did they talk about rent ceilings in this report? I don't think they did. I think something that I thought was missing was the role of gentrification and displacement. I think that when we think about the fabric of our neighborhoods, we really need to think about the broader overarching issues that lead to some issues in our housing. And when you look at, gentrification is a pretty broad aspect to look at, but I think it's really important, and that can come down to even what workers are making for their wages and those sort of overarching wealth inequality that we have. And so I think being a little bit more looking at a little bit more of the root causes, like things like gentrification as displacement, and is a way to think of renter protections, not just as, sort of immediate, but sort of the overarching issues. Some other things I thought were left out was I didn't feel like there was enough discernment between renters versus, like in public housing and social housing versus for-profit housing, and the ways in which that can look really different for renters. And then some things that I would have just loved to have seen personally, which maybe is a bit pie in the sky, but things like cooperatives and the community land trust model, and thinking about which kind of gets at looking at the social housing and how that affects renters. But I think in terms of looking at broader renter protections could be good to look at further. And so then in terms of, and then another, and this again is another issue just with the scope in terms of making sure that we have a comprehensive, and I understand it's, it's a 19-page document, but, I think some of these things could have been added, especially around looking at where we, I think it was like New York, California, Oregon, San Francisco. There was about 5 or 6 locations that were cited. That seemed a little bit limited to me. And then also just didn't really look at outside of the U.S. I think there's a lot of examples that we can think of in terms of housing that aren't specific to the U.S. and that that really limits us in terms of our perspective. So I was hoping to see some of that, and I was disappointed that that wasn't in there. And then in terms of things that were listed in the report but weren't recommended, and I think this already gets at what Councilor Hanson, I was disappointed to see that rent control did not make the final list. I think that's a conversation that's happening nationwide when you're looking at a report that's talking about the historic tenant protections that are going on around the country. When you put that in Google, the main thing that's going to come up is rent control. That's why it's historic, in my opinion. I mean, there are other fantastic things like just cause eviction and right to counsel and other things going on, like in Philly and et cetera and so forth. But that is really the main thing. It's really a focus right now, and so I was really pretty disappointed to see that didn't make it into the final recommendation. And then, like around landlord licensing and then fair housing. There was mention in the report about discrimination, but it didn't really make it into the final. Like, for example, my housing right now is exempt from the Fair Housing Act, and I'm curious to see how we could increase and really support tenants on the local level in terms of their right to fair housing. And there's a lot of exemptions around that, and I know, at least on the state level, and I would be really curious on the municipal level, how that could be developed. So that was sort of my initial commentary. I think that, just the recommendations that came out of it seemed pretty light. So I was frankly a bit disappointed in that. I think the pros that came out of it were the just cause eviction, of course, the COC rating system, and then I wrote them all down. The expansion of public supports, I think that's fantastic. I think tenants should have, we should have more support for tenants on the local level, and make that public and accessible to more folks. So I mean, I know Mr. Mayor already spoke to leaving out rent control. I'm not sure if you want to speak to any of the other things that I mentioned were left out, or but that was my main issue, is sort of the lack of the scope, wanting the scope to be broader, and then wondering about those key things around rent control, landlord licensing, and some of the housing discrimination and fair housing.